The silence of Timber Falls rain came to Timber Falls, Oregon in November 1985, the kind that turned the world gray and kept it that way. 34-year-old Michael Sanderson disappeared on the 17th of that month, leaving behind his Chevy pickup in the mill parking lot, engine cold, driver's door hanging open like a question no one wanted to ask. The case went cold as the winter rain turned to snow, buried under the weight of a town that preferred its secrets deep and its silences deeper. 38 years later, a geological age in human terms, an instant in the memory of guilt, Detective Sarah Chen pulled Michael's file from the archives on a night when insomnia had her by the throat. New DNA technology, science that would have seemed like magic in 1985, breathed life into evidence that had waited in darkness for decades. The truth emerged, like something drowning finally breaking the surface. What the evidence revealed would shatter the careful mythology a small town had built around its own innocence. This is a story about how communities protect their own, even when their own are monsters. About the peculiar blindness that descends when acknowledging truth would cost too much. The killer walked among them for nearly 4 decades, and perhaps the most devastating revelation was how many people, deep down, had always known. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of America's most haunting cold cases, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue investigating and sharing these important stories. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Detective Sarah Chen didn't sleep well anymore. Hadn't for years, if she was honest with herself, which she tried to be in the dead hours when lying to yourself seemed pointless. It was 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October 2023 when she descended into the basement archives of the Timber Falls Police Department, a building that had outlived its usefulness but persisted anyway, like so many things in this town. The archives had that particular smell of institutional memory, papers slowly returning to dust, mildew growing in corners, the fluorescent lights never quite reached, the ghost of cigarette smoke from decades when detectives could light up over murder files. She'd been coming down here more often lately, pulled by something she couldn't quite name. Insomnia, her ex-husband would have said. Obsession, her therapist suggested gently. Maybe both were right. The file boxes stood in rows like tombstones, each one a life interrupted, a question never answered. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, creating more shadows than it dispelled. She knew which box she was looking for. Had known since she transferred to Timber Falls PD 3 months ago and first heard the name Michael Sanderson mentioned in the break room, spoken in that particular tone of voice. Hushed, quick, followed by a change of subject. The box sat on the top shelf in the corner marked 1985 cold. Her fingers found it in the dark through muscle memory, though she'd only been down here twice before. Some cases call to you like that. Some dead speak louder than others. She carried the box to the metal table under the single working light fixture and opened it with the reverence it deserved. Inside, photographs yellowed at the edges, witness statements typed on an actual typewriter, evidence bags with chain of custody forms that predated computers. The archaeology of a vanished life, preserved but not protected, remembered but not solved. Michael Sanderson stared up at her from his DMV photo. Brown hair, hazel eyes, a slight smile that suggested someone who didn't take himself too seriously. 34 years old when the photograph was taken. 34 forever now. Sarah spread the contents across the table. Outside, rain began to fall, that persistent Oregon drizzle that could last for days. The sound on the basement windows was like fingers tapping, asking to be let in, or maybe asking to be let out. She'd been a cold case detective for 7 years now, ever since the divorce made it clear she needed a job that matched her broken sleep patterns. But something about this case felt different. The way people in town changed the subject when his name came up. The way the original detective's notes read more like an ending than an investigation. The way the file had been buried in a corner. Not lost exactly, but not found either. Sarah pulled out the evidence list. Among the items collected, fingernail scrapings from the victim. In 1985, they'd run what tests they could and found nothing useful. But now, in 2023, with DNA technology that could pull profiles from a few cells, from decades-old evidence preserved in the right conditions, she reached for her phone. The crime lab wouldn't open for another 5 hours, but she composed the email anyway, her fingers moving with the kind of purpose that only comes at 3 in the morning when you're on to something. The rain continued to fall. In the photographs, Michael Sanderson continued to smile, frozen in a moment before he knew what was coming. And somewhere in this town, someone who'd kept a secret for 38 years was sleeping peacefully, believing they'd gotten away with it. Not for much longer, Sarah thought. Flashback. November 17th, 1985. Michael Sanderson woke that Sunday morning to rain against the window and the knowledge that he had one more shift before his week off. The thought sat in his chest like a stone. Not dread exactly, but something close to it. Anticipation mixed with the kind of fatigue that goes bone deep when you've been doing the same job for 12 years. He lay in bed, listening to his wife, Jennifer, breathing beside him. The even rhythm of someone who could sleep through anything. She'd been like that since they were 18, since before the mill job and the mortgage and the slow realization that life in Timber Falls was smaller than either of them had dreamed back in high school. The clock read 5:23 a.m. His shift started at 6. In the kitchen, he made coffee in the percolator his mother had given them as a wedding gift, watched it bubble up through the glass dome, turning from clear to amber. Through the window over the sink, he could see the neighbor's porch light still on, a small sun in the pre-dawn darkness. The Hendersons. Tom worked graveyard at the mill too, different shift rotation. They'd wave to each other in passing, two men caught in the same economic machinery, ground down to the same exhausted nod of recognition. Michael poured his coffee and stood at the counter in his work clothes, jeans worn soft at the knees, flannel shirt, steel-toed boots that needed replacing but would last another season if he was careful. Money was tight. Money was always tight. That's what he told himself when the dreams about leaving crept in late at night, when he imagined loading up the truck and just driving, anywhere, somewhere that wasn't here. But there was Jennifer, still sleeping upstairs. There was the mortgage. There was the particular gravity of a small town that pulled you back, even when you tried to imagine escape. He drank his coffee black and bitter, the way his father had taught him, back when his father was still alive to teach him things. The house creaked around him in the way old houses do, settling into itself, making the small sounds of inanimate companionship. At 5:45, he left a note for Jennifer. Early shift, back by 3, love you, and stepped out into the rain. The mill parking lot was already half full when he arrived. Night shift ending, day shift beginning, the eternal rotation of labor that kept this town alive. Michael parked in his usual spot, 3rd row, under the maple tree that would provide shade in summer, but now just dripped rain down his neck as he walked to the clock-in station. Sanderson. Bill Morrison, the shift supervisor, nodded as Michael punched his time card. They'd worked together for a decade, shared coffee breaks and complaints about management, but never quite crossed into friendship. The mill didn't encourage that. Too easy to get emotional when someone lost a finger or worse in the machinery. Better to keep it professional, keep it distant. The work was what it always was. Loud, repetitive, dangerous in that background way that required constant attention, but never quite enough to keep your mind from wandering. Michael operated the saw that cut raw logs into boards, a job that demanded precision and offered none of the satisfaction of building something, only the industrial satisfaction of destruction transformed into product. During his lunch break, he sat in the break room with the other men, half listening to football talk, half thinking about his plans for the week off. He and Jennifer had talked about driving to the coast, maybe Cannon Beach, walk the tide pools, eat at that seafood place they'd gone to on their honeymoon. But gas was expensive, and Jennifer's hours at the grocery store had been cut, and the coast would still be there next month, next year. Tom Henderson sat down across from him, unwrapping a sandwich his wife had made. They exchanged the usual pleasantries: weather, work, the Seahawks' terrible season. Then Tom leaned in slightly, voice dropping. "You going to the thing at the community center next week?" Michael knew what he meant. Pastor Carlson had been organizing community meetings, talking about traditional values and protecting our town. Michael had been to one, found himself uncomfortable with the rhetoric, the way certain people were blamed for everything wrong with the world. He'd stopped going. "Probably not," Michael said. Tom nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. "Probably for the best," he said, and stood up, leaving half his sandwich behind. The interaction sat wrong with Michael for the rest of his shift, a splinter he couldn't quite locate. When 3 p.m. finally came, he clocked out, waved goodbye to Bill Morrison, and headed to his truck. The parking lot was nearly empty. Most of day shift had left an hour ago. The rain had stopped, leaving everything slick and reflective, puddles like mirrors scattered across the asphalt. Michael reached his truck, key already in hand. He never heard the approach from behind, never had time to turn, to see, to understand. The blow came sudden and complete, darkness swallowing the gray afternoon whole. Jennifer Sanderson knew something was wrong at 3:45 p.m. She was home from her shift at Safeway, still in her green vest and name tag, making a late lunch when the wrongness settled over her like a change in air pressure before a storm. Michael should have been home by now. He was never late. 12 years of mill work had made him punctual as a clock, reliable as sunrise. By 4:30, she called the mill. Bill Morrison answered, confusion in his voice. Michael clocked out at 3, saw him leave myself. By 5, she called their neighbor, Tom Henderson. Had he seen Michael's truck? Tom's wife answered, said Tom wasn't home from his shift yet. She'd tell him to call. By 6 as darkness fell complete and absolute, Jennifer knew. That particular knowledge that comes to women who've spent their lives in small towns, who've heard the stories, who understand that sometimes men leave for work and don't come home, and it's not always an accident. She called the police at 6:23 p.m. Officer David Reynolds arrived at 6:47, young and uncertain, taking notes with a ballpoint pen that kept sticking. Missing person reports required 24 hours, he explained gently. Usually men who disappear turn up drunk, or with another woman, or just needed to blow off steam. Usually. But Jennifer's face must have convinced him this wasn't usually, because he radioed it in, got permission to drive by the mill, check the parking lot. They found Michael's Chevy at 7:15 p.m., parked in its usual spot under the maple tree, driver's door hanging open like a scream no one had heard, keys in the ignition, wallet on the dashboard, his lunch pail on the passenger seat, thermos still half full of coffee gone cold. What wasn't there? Michael. Any sign of struggle? Any explanation? Officer Reynolds called for backup, and the machinery of investigation lurched into motion. Crime scene tape, flashlights cutting through darkness, questions asked of night shift workers arriving for their rotation. Had anyone seen anything unusual? Had Michael seemed troubled? Did he have enemies? The answer to all of it: no, no, no. By midnight, the rain had started again, washing away whatever traces might have existed, returning everything to that gray Oregon state of erasure. By 3 a.m., Jennifer sat at her kitchen table surrounded by detectives and officers and the particular violence of other people's questions, her coffee untouched, her hands folded in her lap, her mind already building the architecture of grief that would become her life. And somewhere in the darkness, in the rain, in the vast indifference of the forest that surrounded Timber Falls like a wall, Michael Sanderson was becoming a mystery instead of a man. The investigation that followed was exactly what you'd expect from a small-town police department in 1985, thorough in its way, hampered by limitations that wouldn't become apparent for decades. Detective James Wheeler took lead, a 20-year veteran who'd worked exactly 3 homicides in his career, none of them solved. He approached Michael's case with the grim determination of a man who knew he was probably going to fail, but had to try anyway. They interviewed everyone: Jennifer, who passed a polygraph and suspicion both; the mill workers, who provided alibis that couldn't be broken, wouldn't be broken, because breaking them would mean acknowledging that something dark lived in their community; the neighbors, who'd seen nothing, heard nothing, that particular small-town blindness that protects comfort over truth. They searched the woods around the mill, dogs tracking scents that went nowhere, volunteers combing through undergrowth until the rain made it impossible, until winter made it dangerous. They dragged the river that ran through town, that cold water yielding nothing but logs and silt and the rusted carcasses of shopping carts. They collected evidence: fingerprints from the truck, all Michael's, soil samples from the parking lot, local clay found everywhere, those fingernail scrapings that would prove essential decades later, but were meaningless in 1985. They developed theories. Maybe Michael ran off, started a new life. Maybe he was murdered by a transient passing through. Maybe he stumbled into the woods injured and died of exposure, his body becoming food for the forest. Each theory had its believers, its problems, its appeal. The truth remained hidden. By February 1986, the case went cold. Not officially closed, but moved to that particular purgatory of unsolved crimes, filed away, rarely reviewed, slowly forgotten by everyone except Jennifer and the few people who'd actually loved Michael Sanderson. Detective Wheeler retired in 1991. The Michael Sanderson case his greatest failure, the one that haunted his dreams when whiskey couldn't keep them away. He'd call Jennifer on the anniversary every year, tell her he was sorry, tell her he hadn't forgotten. She'd thank him quietly, and they'd both pretend the conversation mattered. The years accumulated like sediment. The town moved on. The mill kept running. Jennifer never remarried, never left, became one of those women defined by absence, by the husband who disappeared, by the particular tragedy that made her simultaneously visible and invisible in community consciousness. And Michael Sanderson transformed from person to story, to cautionary tale, to footnote, another name on the list of mysteries that small towns keep like secrets, buried but never quite dead. Until Detective Sarah Chen, 38 years later, pulled his file from the archives and decided the dead deserved better than to be forgotten. The DNA results came back on a Thursday in November 2023, exactly 38 years and 2 weeks after Michael Sanderson's disappearance. Sarah Chen sat in her office reading the report 3 times, not because she didn't understand it, but because understanding it meant accepting what came next. The fingernail scrapings had yielded a profile, partial, but sufficient. Male DNA, not Michael's, preserved by some miracle of chemistry and cold storage, and the right kind of evidence bag used by a crime scene tech who died in 1997. Sarah ran the profile through CODIS first. No match. Then through the genealogical databases, the ones that had revolutionized cold casework in the past 5 years, the ones that made everyone who'd spit in a tube to learn about their ancestry unwitting participants in criminal investigation. The results came back like an accusation. 3rd cousin match, 4th cousin match, enough branches on the family tree to triangulate down to a specific lineage, a specific possibility, a specific name. Thomas James Henderson, age 76, retired mill worker, living in the same house on Maple Street he'd occupied since 1979, married to Patricia Henderson for 53 years, father of 2, grandfather of 5, member of the Timber Falls Community Church, volunteer at the food bank. The kind of man people described as pillar of the community. That phrase that always meant someone had built their life on a foundation of lies. Sarah sat with this knowledge for 3 days, running down every other possibility, checking and rechecking the genealogy, the DNA percentages, the science that never lied even when everything else did. Tom Henderson had been Michael Sanderson's co-worker. They'd worked overlapping shifts. He'd been interviewed in the original investigation, had an alibi provided by his wife, had seemed genuinely shocked and saddened by his friend's disappearance, had worked the same job for another 15 years before retiring with full pension, had lived his entire life in the same small town, raising his family, coaching Little League, attending church potlucks, accumulating the markers of ordinary decency while carrying murder like a stone in his pocket. On the 4th day, Sarah drove past his house, a neat ranch style on a street lined with maples, lawn still green in November, American flag hanging from the porch, garden gnomes arranged in the flower beds, his truck in the driveway, a newer model than what he'd driven in 1985, but same color, same make. Some preferences don't change. She watched him come out to get his mail. An old man now, hair white, shoulders stooped, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had logged too many years of hard labor. He waved to a passing neighbor, checked his mailbox, went back inside, perfectly ordinary, perfectly normal, perfectly terrifying in its mundanity. Sarah returned to the station and wrote her report. Then she called the district attorney. The arrest came at dawn on a Monday, that particular time when the world exists in gray twilight, not quite day, not quite night. Sarah insisted on being there, though technically, the U.S. Marshals who handled the warrant didn't need her. They surrounded the house as sunrise threatened, but hadn't quite arrived. Sarah stood by her car watching the front door, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Satisfaction, dread, the weight of setting in motion something that couldn't be stopped. The lead marshal knocked. Patricia Henderson answered in her bathrobe, confusion on her face shifting to terror as she understood what the men in tactical gear meant, what they wanted, what they'd come to destroy. Tom Henderson appeared behind her in the doorway. He looked at Sarah, at the marshals, at the warrant being read, and something crossed his face. Not surprise, not exactly. More like resignation. The look of a man who'd been waiting 38 years for this knock, this moment, this end. He didn't fight, didn't protest, just asked if he could put on pants, could kiss his wife goodbye, could grab his medications. the mundane requests of someone being arrested for murder, as if protocol mattered, as if any of this was normal. Patricia was crying, asking what this was about, what they thought he'd done. The marshals wouldn't answer. That wasn't their job. Sarah wanted to tell her, wanted to prepare her for what was coming, but that wasn't her job either. They led him to the car in handcuffs, and he shuffled like the old man he was, the arthritis and bad back and worn knees visible in his gait. At the car door, he turned to look back at his house, his wife standing in the doorway still crying, the life he'd built about to collapse around him. His eyes met Sarah's, and she saw in them something she couldn't quite name. Not remorse, maybe recognition. Two people who'd thought about Michael Sanderson across decades, for very different reasons, meeting at last. "Detective Chen," he said quietly. Just her name, nothing else. Then they put him in the car and drove him away, and Sarah stood in the driveway as the sun finally broke over the horizon, turning everything gold, making the world look beautiful in that way that felt like mockery. The interrogation room at the county jail had that quality of spaces designed to erase personality. Cinder block walls painted institutional beige, fluorescent lights humming their endless mechanical song, a metal table bolted to the floor, chairs that made your back hurt if you sat too long. Tom Henderson sat perfectly still, hands folded on the table, looking at nothing in particular. His lawyer, court-appointed, sat beside him whispering occasionally, probably advising him to say nothing, which was always the smart play. Sarah sat across from them, a file folder in front of her containing the DNA report, the genealogical analysis, the photographs from 1985. She'd done this dance before, this careful choreography of revelation and denial. "Mr. Henderson," she began, "do you remember Michael Sanderson?" His eyes focused on her then, clear and steady. "Of course. Michael was my friend. Tell me about November 17th, 1985. That was a long time ago, Detective. You remember it, though." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a truck rumbled past. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed their anxious song. "I remember Michael disappeared that day. I remember being questioned. I remember his wife, Jennifer, how broken she was. I remember thinking how fragile everything is, how quickly life can change." "Where were you that afternoon?" "I told the police then. I was at home with my wife." "And she confirmed that?" "She did." Sarah opened the file folder, pulled out the DNA report, slid it across the table. Tom Henderson looked at it, but didn't reach for it, as if touching it would make it real. "Your DNA was found under Michael Sanderson's fingernails," Sarah said. "He fought back. Not much, not long enough, but enough to leave evidence. Evidence that waited 38 years to tell the truth." Tom's lawyer leaned in, whispered urgently. Tom shook his head slightly. "Science doesn't lie, Mr. Henderson. People lie. Wives lie for husbands. Communities lie for themselves. But DNA is just chemistry, and chemistry doesn't care about loyalty or love or the life you built afterward." Tom Henderson was silent. Sarah waited. Silence was a tool as effective as any question. Finally, "I'd like to speak with my attorney privately." Sarah stood. At the door, she paused. "Jennifer Sanderson never remarried, never had children, spent 38 years wondering what happened to her husband. You took his life, but you took hers too. Just slower." Tom Henderson's eyes met hers, and she saw what she'd suspected in that dawn driveway. He'd been carrying this his entire life, this weight, this knowledge. Maybe it had eaten him alive in small ways. Maybe it hadn't. Either way, it didn't matter. Justice wasn't about his suffering. It was about Michael's. She left him there in that small room with his lawyer and his lies and the evidence that wouldn't stop being true, no matter how much anyone wanted it to. When Sarah Chen drove to Jennifer Sanderson's house that afternoon, the rain had started again. That eternal Oregon precipitation that seemed to carry memory in each drop. Jennifer lived in the same house she'd shared with Michael, a small bungalow on the edge of town that had aged the way she had, slowly, with quiet dignity, accumulating the marks of time. The garden was still maintained. Flowers that would bloom in spring, now just dead stalks waiting for resurrection. Sarah knocked on the door and waited, her badge in her pocket, but her hands empty, unsure what gesture was appropriate for what she had to say. Jennifer answered, and Sarah recognized her from the photographs in the file, though 38 years had transformed her. 72 now, hair silver, face lined with the particular geography of grief, deeper around the eyes, the mouth, places where sorrow had carved its passage. "Mrs. Sanderson, I'm Detective Sarah Chen. May I come in?" Something in Jennifer's face shifted, that instant recognition of what a detective at your door after all these years could only mean. Not hope, exactly. Maybe completion. Inside, the house was a museum of their life together. Photographs on every surface. Michael young and smiling. Michael and Jennifer on their wedding day. Michael at the mill. Michael and Jennifer at the coast. That trip they'd taken before the money got tight. Frozen moments of a life interrupted, preserved like insects in amber. They sat in the living room, and Sarah told her what she'd found, how she'd found it, who she'd arrested. Jennifer listened without interruption, her hands folded in her lap the same way her husband's had been that morning in the interrogation room, some universal language of containing the unbearable. When Sarah finished, Jennifer was quiet for a long time. Rain continued against the windows. The house creaked its old familiar sounds. "Tom Henderson," Jennifer finally said. "He came to the funeral. Well, the memorial service. No body, so no funeral. He stood in the back of the church and cried. I remember thinking how it hurt him too, losing Michael, how the whole town was wounded by it." She looked at Sarah then, eyes that had seen too much, understood too much. "He lived here all this time, raised his children, went to the same grocery store as me. We'd see each other, nod hello, and he knew. The whole time, he knew." "I'm sorry," Sarah said, "because what else was there?" "Don't be. You found him. That's more than anyone else did. More than I thought would ever happen." Jennifer stood, walked to the mantel, picked up a photograph of Michael. Young in it, maybe 25, standing in front of his truck, that slight smile, those eyes that didn't know what was coming. I used to dream he'd walk through that door, that there was some explanation, some reason, something that made sense. For years, I kept his things, his clothes in the closet, his tools in the garage, just in case he came home. She set the photograph down carefully, exactly where it had been. Now I know. He's not coming home. He's been gone this whole time, and someone I smiled at in passing, someone I thought was a good man, someone I trusted. He's the reason why. She turned to face Sarah, and something in her expression was harder than grief, stronger than pain. "I want to testify. When this goes to trial, I want to look him in the eye. I want him to know that Michael mattered, that his life meant something, that taking it wasn't something you just walk away from." "You'll have that chance," Sarah promised. As she left Jennifer's house and drove back through the rain to the station, Sarah thought about the 2 lives destroyed that November day in 1985. Michael's ended in a moment of violence. Jennifer's extended into decades of not knowing, half-living, existing in the purgatory of unanswered questions. And Tom Henderson's? Had he suffered? Had guilt eaten him? Or had he simply compartmentalized, put it away, lived his life as if it had never happened? The trial would answer some questions, but some questions had no answers. That's what made them haunt you. The trial of Thomas James Henderson began on a Monday in April 2024 in the county courthouse that had stood for 90 years, presiding over disputes and crimes that were usually smaller, quieter, less devastating than this. The courthouse had that particular atmosphere of institutional gravity: dark wood paneling, high ceilings, uncomfortable benches that forced you to sit up straight. The flags, American Oregon, hung motionless in conditioned air. Justice depicted in sculpture and painting on the walls, blindfolded, holding her scales, pretending impartiality was possible. The prosecution's opening statement came from District Attorney Marcus Webb, a man who'd built his career on drug cases and drunk driving, now facing the most high-profile trial of his life. He stood before the jury. 12 people pulled from their ordinary lives to judge the extraordinary, and told them a story they already knew from the news coverage, but hearing it in this room made it different, made it real. Michael Sanderson woke up on November 17, 1985, expecting an ordinary day, his last before a week off, his last before a trip to the coast with his wife, his last day alive, though he didn't know it. Webb's voice was steady, practiced, but underneath Sarah could hear the effort of maintaining composure in the face of what he was describing. The defendant, Thomas Henderson, worked with Michael at the lumber mill. They knew each other for 12 years. They shared coffee breaks and conversation. Michael trusted him. Webb paused. Let that word, trusted, settle into the courtroom like sediment. That afternoon, in the parking lot, the defendant killed Michael Sanderson. We know this because Michael fought back. Not long enough, not hard enough to save himself, but enough to leave evidence under his fingernails. Evidence that has waited 38 years to speak. Evidence that speaks now, clearly and irrefutably, pointing to the defendant. The defense attorney, Samuel Cross, experienced, expensive, paid for by Henderson's family's second mortgage, stood and delivered his counter-narrative. Reasonable doubt, contamination of evidence, the unreliability of DNA from decades-old samples, the possibility of innocent transfer, the lack of motive, the lack of witnesses, the lack of a body. All true, all carefully constructed to create enough uncertainty that a jury might hesitate, might wonder, might acquit. But Sarah, sitting in the gallery behind the prosecution table, knew what evidence was coming, knew what the jury would hear, knew that sometimes truth won, even when wrapped in complexity. The DNA expert testified on Tuesday, a woman named Dr. Patricia Reeves, who'd spent 20 years working in forensic genetics, who spoke about chromosomes and markers and probability with the kind of calm authority that came from knowing absolutely that she was right. The DNA profile recovered from the fingernail scrapings matches the reference sample taken from the defendant to a statistical certainty of 99.9997%, she explained, walking the jury through charts and graphs that transformed murder into mathematics, guilt into genetics. Cross-examined her aggressively, pushing on every technical detail, every possible point of uncertainty. Had the evidence been properly stored? Could there have been contamination? What about degradation over time? Dr. Reeves handled each question with the patience of someone who'd been challenged before, who understood that her job was to withstand attack without yielding ground. The science was sound. The science didn't lie. On Wednesday, Sarah took the stand. She'd testified dozens of times, but this felt different. This case had become personal in ways she knew it shouldn't, had worked its way under her skin in that 3 a.m. way that cold cases did when you let them. Webb walked her through her investigation, finding the file, submitting the evidence, running the genealogical analysis, the arrest. Clean, factual, building the narrative brick by brick. Detective Chen, in your professional opinion, based on the evidence, did Thomas Henderson kill Michael Sanderson? Yes. And what led you to this conclusion? Sarah looked at the jury, 12 faces trying to stay neutral, trying to process information that rewrote their understanding of their community, their neighbors, their town's history. The DNA evidence is irrefutable. But beyond that, the investigation revealed a pattern. Mr. Henderson had motive. Webb had fought to get motive in, argued it was crucial context, won that battle. Based on ideological differences with the victim, he had opportunity. They worked together. He knew Michael's schedule. He was in the parking lot that day. And he had 38 years to perfect his alibi, to hide behind his reputation, to let everyone forget while he remembered. Cross's cross-examination was sharp, professional, designed to undermine her certainty. Had she investigated other suspects? Had she considered alternative theories? Wasn't it possible the DNA transfer happened innocently, days before? Sarah held her ground. DNA under fingernails, in that quantity, in that context, indicates defensive wounds. Michael Sanderson was fighting for his life. The person he was fighting was Thomas Henderson. On Thursday, Jennifer Sanderson testified. She walked to the witness stand with the slow dignity of someone who'd waited nearly 4 decades for this moment, who'd imagined it countless times, who knew it wouldn't bring her husband back, but might bring something close to peace. Webb kept his questions simple, respectful of her grief, mindful of the jury watching an elderly woman describe the worst day of her life and every day since. Mrs. Sanderson, tell us about Michael. And she did. Not the sanitized version, not the victim as saint narrative that funerals produce, but the real man. Michael, who burned toast and left his socks on the floor and laughed too loud at bad jokes and worked too hard for too little money and loved her imperfectly but completely. The jury listened, rapt, as Jennifer transformed her husband from case file to person, from evidence to life interrupted. And when he didn't come home that day? I knew, Jennifer said simply. Not how, not why, but I knew he wasn't coming back. Some things you just know. Tears were running down her face, but her voice stayed steady. 38 years of practice controlling grief in public, of crying alone where it wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable. If you could say anything to the defendant, what would it be? Cross objected, but the judge allowed it. Jennifer turned in the witness box, looked directly at Tom Henderson for the first time since the trial began. He met her eyes, and something passed between them. Recognition of shared history, of parallel lives that had intersected in violence and diverged into different kinds of suffering. You knew him, Jennifer said. You worked beside him. You came to his memorial service, and you let me spend 38 years wondering, hoping, dying slowly from not knowing. That's 2 murders, Mr. Henderson, his and mine. The only difference is, I'm still breathing. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, caught in the gravity of the moment. Jennifer looked away from Henderson, back to the jury. Find him guilty. Let Michael rest. Let me rest. Let this town finally admit what it's been hiding all these years. That evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it looks like your neighbor, Sometimes it looks like someone you trust. The closing arguments came on Friday, both attorneys performing the ritual of summarization, of emotional appeal, of final persuasion. Webb stood before the jury and spoke simply. The evidence speaks. The science is clear. Thomas Henderson killed Michael Sanderson. Justice delayed is not justice denied. You have the power to finally give Michael Sanderson and his wife the answer they deserved 38 years ago. Cross countered with doubt, with the possibility of error, with the weight of convicting a 76-year-old man of a crime that couldn't be proven beyond reasonable doubt. Not really. Not with a case this old, this complex, this built on scientific analysis of degraded evidence. The jury retired to deliberate at 3 p.m. on Friday afternoon. Sarah waited in the courthouse cafe, drinking coffee that tasted like institutional defeat, watching the rain outside turn the world gray again. Jennifer sat in the gallery, hands folded, waiting like she'd been waiting for 38 years, patient with the kind of patience that comes from having no other choice. At 9:47 a.m. on Monday morning, the jury returned. The courtroom filled instantly. Press, family, townspeople who'd followed the case, those who'd come to witness history, those who'd come to see their neighbor condemned or exonerated. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. Sarah held her breath. Beside her, another detective squeezed her shoulder. Across the courtroom, Jennifer sat perfectly still, her face composed into that expression of someone who'd learned not to hope, not to expect, just to endure. We find the defendant, Thomas James Henderson, guilty of murder in the first degree. The courtroom erupted. Jennifer's face crumbled, relief and grief indistinguishable, finally allowed to feel everything she'd been holding back. Tom Henderson sat motionless, his face unreadable, as marshals moved to take him into custody. Sarah felt tears on her own face, unexpected, unstoppable. She'd done her job. The system had worked. Michael Sanderson had justice. But justice felt heavier than she'd expected, looked more like an old man being led away in handcuffs, his family crying in the gallery. Felt more like decades of compounding grief finally acknowledged, but never erased. The judge set sentencing for 6 weeks later. Life in prison, almost certainly, though at 76, Henderson's life sentence would be shorter than the sentence he'd given Jennifer. As the courtroom emptied, as reporters rushed to file their stories, as Henderson was led away to await transfer to the state penitentiary, Sarah sat alone in the gallery and thought about what they'd accomplished and what they hadn't. Michael Sanderson was still dead. Jennifer was still broken. Tom Henderson would die in prison, but 38 years of freedom couldn't be reclaimed, couldn't be subtracted from the equation of justice. Outside, the rain continued. It always did in Oregon. Some things never changed. Some griefs never healed. But at least now, everyone knew the truth. At least now, Michael's name meant more than mystery. At least now, the silence had been broken. 3 months after the trial, Sarah Chen drove to the Oregon State Penitentiary to interview Tom Henderson. She'd told herself she wouldn't, that the case was closed, that there was nothing more to learn. But the question haunted her. Why? They met in a visitor's room, separated by plexiglass, speaking through phones. Henderson looked smaller than he had in court, diminished by prison clothes and the particular weight of accepting your own guilt. "Detective Chen," he said, "I wondered if you'd come. Why did you do it?" He was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah waited, patient now with the patience of someone who'd learned that some answers take time. "Michael was different," Henderson finally said. "Not in ways that mattered, but in ways I was taught mattered. He didn't attend the community meetings, didn't share our concerns. He'd argue, gently, when I'd talk about protecting traditional values, made me feel small. Sarah waited for more, for the explanation that would make it make sense. It didn't come. That's it? Ideological differences? That's why you killed him? No. Henderson looked down at his hands, old and spotted, hands that had killed once and carried mail and bounced grandchildren and done 1,000 ordinary things in between. I killed him because I could, because I was angry, and he was there. And in that moment, I chose violence. Do you regret it? Every day. He looked up, met her eyes through the plexiglass. But regret doesn't bring him back, doesn't give Jennifer her life, doesn't undo what I did. I've lived with it for 38 years. I'll die with it. That's my sentence, even before a judge said the words. Sarah wanted to feel satisfaction, closure, the clean ending that solving a case should bring. Instead, she felt the weight of irreconcilable truths, that Henderson had suffered, and his suffering meant nothing, that he was human, and his humanity made his crime worse, not better. Michael's family wants you to know they forgive you, she lied, because Jennifer had said nothing of the sort, had said only that she hoped he lived long enough to feel every day of his sentence. Henderson smiled slightly, sadly. No, they don't. I wouldn't. Sarah drove back to Timber Falls as the sun set, turning the sky orange and purple and gold, beauty that felt inappropriate, felt like the world wasn't paying attention to what mattered. She'd solved the case. Michael Sanderson's murderer was in prison. Jennifer had her answer. The town had been forced to confront its collective blindness, its complicity in Henderson's freedom. But Sarah understood something now that she hadn't when she first opened that file at 3 a.m. all those months ago. Solving a case doesn't undo it. Justice is important, necessary, fundamental. But it's not resurrection. It doesn't bring back the dead, doesn't unbreak the broken. Michael Sanderson was still gone, would always be gone. His life was still just 34 years, interrupted, abbreviated, ended by a man who went home afterward and had dinner with his wife. And Jennifer got to know, finally, but knowing didn't return. The decades she'd lost to wondering. Didn't give her the children she might have had, the life she might have lived, the husband who should have grown old beside her. Some cases haunt you, not because they're unsolved, but because solving them reveals truths you wish weren't true, that people you trust can betray you, that communities protect their own, even when their own are monsters, that justice is real, but it's insufficient, unable to balance the scales it's meant to balance. Sarah thought about Michael Sanderson's last moments, the parking lot, the rain, the blow he never saw coming, the brief fight, the fingernails scraping, the evidence left behind like a message in a bottle, waiting decades to be found. Did he know he was dying? Did he think of Jennifer? Did he feel afraid? Or did darkness come too quickly for fear? She'd never know. Some questions have no answers. Some silences can't be broken. What she did know, Michael Sanderson mattered. His life mattered. His death mattered. And now, finally, his story was complete. Not the ending anyone wanted, but the ending that was true. That would have to be enough. Jennifer Sanderson still lives in the same house, still maintains the same garden, still keeps Michael's photograph on the mantle. She's 72 now, has outlived her husband's murderer. Tom Henderson died of a heart attack in prison 7 months into his sentence, escaping the decades of incarceration that were meant to be his penance. She says she doesn't feel cheated by his death, says the guilty verdict was what mattered, the public acknowledgement, the truth finally spoken out loud. Says she can rest now, knowing. But Sarah sees in her eyes that particular exhaustion of those who've carried grief too long, and wonders if knowing is really enough, if truth really sets anyone free, or if some chains are permanent, some wounds never close, some losses compound rather than heal. The case file on Michael Sanderson now reads, "Solved" in the database. The evidence is back in storage, no longer needed, preserved now as historical artifact. The trial transcripts exist in the courthouse basement. The news stories have been written and forgotten. Life continues in Timber Falls. The mill still runs. People still work and marry and have children and die. The rain still falls with that eternal Oregon persistence. And somewhere in all of it, the memory of Michael Sanderson exists, not quite forgotten, not quite remembered, existing in that gray space between past and present, between injustice and justice, between silence and story. Sarah transferred to another department 6 months after the trial. Too many ghosts in Timber Falls, too many 3 a.m. questions that wouldn't stop asking themselves. She still works cold cases, still descends into archives, still pulls files on people whose deaths deserve answers. But she knows now what she didn't know before, that solving a case is the beginning, not the end. That justice is necessary, but insufficient. That some stories don't have clean endings, just endings that are true. And sometimes, on rainy nights when sleep won't come, she thinks about Michael Sanderson walking to his truck on that gray November afternoon in 1985, unaware that the next few seconds would define the rest of his wife's life, would create a mystery that would take nearly 4 decades to solve, would become a story told in courtrooms and case files and true crime documentaries. He was just a man going to his truck, just a person living an ordinary life, just someone who worked too hard for too little money and loved his wife and dreamed of the ocean until someone decided he shouldn't be. That's the thing about murder. It's always a decision, a choice, a moment when someone decides their anger, their ideology, their whatever it is, matters more than another person's right to exist. Tom Henderson made that choice in a parking lot in 1985. Michael Sanderson paid for it. Jennifer Sanderson is still paying. And the rest of us are left to witness, to remember, to insist that his life mattered, that his death mattered, that truth matters even when it comes too late to do anything but ache. The rain falls, the years pass, the dead stay dead. But their stories we can tell, their names we can remember, their justice, however delayed, however insufficient, however incomplete, that we can give. It's not enough. It never is. But it's all we have.